Empires are not supposed to starve. They fall to invasions, to rebellions, to assassins. This one, however, fell to empty plates. No enemy crossed its borders. No capital was stormed. No final battle was ever fought. Instead, the food just stopped coming, granaries emptied, bread disappeared, and hunger spread faster than any army ever could. By the time the empire understood what was happening, the damage was already permanent. Because starvation doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps in, and once it takes hold, it never lets go. This empire was powerful because it was organized. Fields stretched for miles. Taxes flowed inward. Grain moved along roads, rivers, and sea lanes. Food was more than survival. It was a tool of control. Cities existed because the countryside fed them. Armies marched because supply wagons followed. Politics functioned because bread kept the people calm. As long as food moved, the empire held together. And for generations, it did. The system was efficient, centralized, and confident. Perhaps too confident. Everything depended on one single belief, that the food would always arrive. At first, the change was subtle. Harvests were slightly smaller. Shipments arrived a little late. Officials adjusted records. Rations were reduced quietly. No announcements were made because empires don't panic at shortages. They explain them away. Bad weather, poor planning, a temporary disruption. But the shortages returned. Again and again. Granaries stopped filling completely. Markets raised prices. The poor noticed first, then the soldiers, then the cities. Still, the empire insisted this was manageable. It always had been before. Then the explanations stopped working. Bread lines formed, not massive ones at first, just long enough to notice. People arrived earlier each morning, waited longer, and argued more. Officials blamed hoarders, merchants were accused of greed. Punishments were announced, but punishment doesn't create grain. Food ships arrived half empty. Some never arrived at all. Roads became unsafe, rivers unreliable. Ports were abandoned or damaged. The empire began pulling food from one region to save another. Cities were fed, but the countryside was drained. It worked for a moment. Then came the year of reckoning. Granaries were unlocked, doors were thrown wide open, and officials stared into emptiness. There was no reserve left. The numbers didn't change, no matter how often they were checked. Cities were now living day to day, hour to hour. Hunger does something armies cannot. It dissolves loyalty. Soldiers demanded pay in food. Officials abandoned their posts. Local leaders ignored orders from the capital. Why obey an empire that could no longer feed you? The system fractured along its weakest lines, and there was no way to seal the cracks. Hunger spread inward, not as chaos, but as a slow, crushing pressure. People sold possessions, then furniture, then their tools. Parents skipped meals. Children stopped growing. Disease followed malnutrition as bodies weakened. Work stopped. Fields went unplanted because the farmers themselves were starving, which guaranteed the next harvest would be even worse. The feedback loop locked shut. Starvation now fed itself. The empire issued decrees, rationing laws, price controls, emergency measures. None of them produced a single grain of wheat. Riots erupted, not political ones, but desperate ones. Grain warehouses were stormed. Officials were dragged into the streets, not for cruelty, but for emptiness. Hunger had replaced law. Armies eat first. That's how empires survive. But soon, even they could not be fed. Units were disbanded. Garrisons abandoned. Borders were left unmanned. Not because of defeat, but because soldiers deserted. An empire without food cannot maintain force. and without force, it cannot enforce order. Provinces stopped sending taxes. Cities closed their gates. Local strongmen took control. The empire still existed on parchment, but nowhere else. What makes this collapse so different is what never happened. No enemy marched in. There was nothing left to conquer. Cities were already shrinking. Infrastructure collapsed without maintenance. Roads crumbled, ports silted up. The capital issued orders no one heard or cared to follow. Starvation had done what no army ever could. It dissolved the empire from within. There was no final moment, no burning capital, no execution of an emperor. The empire simply stopped. Trade networks vanished. Administration faded. Records ended mid-sentence. Cities emptied as people moved closer to food, closer to rivers and fields. Urban civilization collapsed back into survival. Generations later, historians struggled to define the moment it ended. Because starvation leaves no ruins, only absence. This empire wasn't defeated, it was unsupported. It collapsed because it depended on a system too fragile to survive disruption. Food was its foundation. When that failed, everything above it followed. Armies, politics, law, identity. Empires can survive invasion. They cannot survive hunger, because hunger turns citizens into strangers, soldiers into deserters, and cities into liabilities. The empire that ran out of food didn't fall in a battle, it faded away. And by the time anyone realized it was gone, there was nothing left to save. Thanks for watching.